Hello, everyone, and welcome to our presentation. We're Group 2, and we will be guiding you today through the two texts assigned to our group, as well as sharing some thoughts on this. And we're going to basically talk about institutions and economic growth. So first of all, let me mention the topics we will be covering. We will go first into the thesis statement. We will look into the first reading, which is Goodbye Washington Consensus, Hello Washington Confusion by Rodrik. Then we'll go into the second reading, which is Do Institutions Cause Growth by Glaeser et al. And finally, we will have a conclusion where we will be wrapping up everything. So now into the first point of the agenda, which is the thesis.
So what we'll be arguing throughout this presentation is that inclusive economic institutions and economic growth are not dependent on inclusive political institutions, as they may be fostered by a wide range of policies. So instead, growth strategies should be based on countries' individual characteristics, such as human capital and historical background. So first, we'll be looking at Rodrik's Goodbye Washington Consensus, Hello Washington Confusion. So in this article, Rodrik states that stabilize, privatize, and liberalize was kind of viewed as a mantra for achieving economic growth and development. So privatization, deregulation, and trade liberalization were some of the key policies that were widely implemented throughout the globe to develop said nations. So after being pursued in much of the Western world, these policies were recommended to some of the sub-Saharan African countries as kind of the best practices which they should follow in order to prosper. But they quickly realized that these reforms were ill-suited to deal with the growing public health emergency, for example. And so sub-Saharan African countries failed to take off. So there were frequent and painful crises that were similar, which were observed in Latin America, East Asia, Russia, and Turkey, where such policies failed to foster growth. So now we'll look at the example of China and India, where rapid economic growth has been observed, which has resulted in the absolute reduction in the number of people living in extreme poverty. And this came as quite a surprise, as these countries have had high levels of trade protection, lack of privatization, extensive industrial policies, and so we're hardly exemplars of the Washington Consensus. So this proves that these ideas and practices might have held sway and worked in some parts of the world at certain times, but have clearly failed in others. So this proves that evidence for macroeconomic policies that lead to national growth is actually quite weak. So whilst Rodrik argues that there's a pressing need for humility, policy diversity, selective and modest reforms and experimentation, and kind of a need for us to distance ourselves from these best practices, the IMF argues that these reforms might have not produced lasting effects because of an institutional conditions that were poor, such as poor governments and corruption, ineffective courts and the judiciary, insufficiently flexible labor market institutions, and so on. But Rodrik states that institutional transformation only takes place very rarely. And so kind of telling poor countries in Latin America or Africa that they have to develop in order to kind of become developed is really poor advice. So he insists that we need to develop new growth strategies which comprise creative and targeted policy design instead.
Okay, so now we're gonna look into Do Institutions Cause Growth by Glaeser et al. To understand the reading, I'm gonna give you a little context. So the authors want to find the answer to the continuing uncertainty as to whether strong and capable political institutions cause economic growth, or if on the contrary, human capital accumulation and development lead to the improvement of institutions. So they report that many of the current indicators defining institutional quality used to prove that institutions cause growth are conceptually unstable, which means that the variables that have so far been used to test this theory do not have a relationship that ensures causation of institutional quality. The basic OLS results and other evidence so far suggest that, first, human capital is a more basic source of growth than our institutions. That poor countries get out of poverty through good policies, often pursued by dictators, and lastly, that this subsequently improves their political institutions. The authors highlight that currently the big challenge of big economies and the world in general is trying to figure out how to ignite growth and at the same time how to establish democracy. So they locate two broad approaches to confronting these challenges. The first one emphasizes the need to start with democracy and governments as mechanisms for securing property rights. This statement argues that with these political institutions in place, investment in human and physical capital will grow and cause economic development as a result. This brings up the idea of limited governments, first proposed by Montesquieu and Smith in the 18th century as promoters of growth. The second emphasizes the need for human and physical capital accumulation first to start the process of institutionalization and democracy. This argument holds that even pro-market dictators can secure property rights as a matter of policy choice. Also, from the point of view of developing countries, democracy and other institutional improvements are the consequences of higher education and wealth, and not a result of. Both views share important similarities. They both emphasize the need for secure property rights to support investment in human and physical capital, and they both see such security as a public policy choice rather than political. However, they differ in the sense that on the one hand, the institutional view sees the pro-investment policies as a consequence of political constraints on government, and the development scope sees the policies in poor countries largely as choices of their leaders, who are typically unconstrained. So what do authors argue? They argue that the fundamental cause of development is investment in human capital, and that this is a policy choice that is often made by leaders in non-democracies. They take up the theory of modernization, which we can recall from the reading of Przeworski and Limongi, as the gradual differentiation and specialization of countries' social structures, such as education, urbanization, communication, technology advances, etc., which eventually translate into democratization. They pose using education as the independent variable rather than GDP, as other authors have done in previous studies, and state that high education democracies are more likely to survive, and high education dictatorships are more likely to transition. So as we've seen before, low educated non-democracies are stable and highly educated democracies are stable, while highly educated non-democracies are unstable and low educated democracies are unstable. We will prove this theory with an example of South and North Korea. So before the Korean War, which started in 1950, both countries were unified and exceptionally poor. Following the end of the Korean War in 1953, both countries established as independent dictatorships. Between 1950 and 1980, the average level of executive constraint in South Korea was higher than in North Korea. The difference is that South Korean dictators chose capitalism and secure property rights, and the country grew rapidly, reaching a per capita income level higher than in North Korea. The North Korean dictator, in contrast, chose socialism, and the country only reached a lower level of income than South Korea in 1980. After 1980, South Korea transformed itself into a democracy, and North Korea stayed as a dictatorship. If we see the progression of over the 50 years between 1950 and the 2000s, South Korea had better institutions measured by higher constraints on the executive. However, it is important to highlight that these institutions are the outcome of economic growth after 1950 and not its cause, proving the development view in which institutions come as a result of the choice of its leaders and are not the basis of growth. Finally, this leads us to our conclusion. So throughout this study, the authors compare various other authors and conclude that in particular, the existing research does not show that political institutions rather than human capital have a causal effect on economic growth. Indeed, much evidence points to the primacy of human capital for both growth and democratization. They highlight the statement that each community faces a set of institutional opportunities determined largely by the human and social capital of its population. So the greater the human and social capital of a community, the more attractive its institutional opportunities. This idea was proposed first by Jean Cobb et al. In 2003 in their paper, The New Comparative Economics. So institutions in this framework are points of opportunity, determined by efficiency, history, and politics. Institutions are highly persistent because history, including colonial history, shapes social choices. But institutional outcomes also get better as the society grows richer. because institutional opportunities improve. So it's crucial to highlight that institutions have only a second-order effect on economic performance. The first-order effect comes from human and social capital, which shape both institutional and productive capacities of a society. However, the authors insist that institutions do matter and suggest that the current measurement strategies have conceptual flaws, and that researchers would do better focusing on actual laws, rules, and compliance procedures that could be manipulated by a policymaker to assess what works and what does not work. None of this is to deny the merits of democracy and the constraints on government as essential human values. And that evidence suggests skepticism about the viability of democracies in countries with a low level of human capital, as there have been few examples of such democracies in the world. Lastly, they side with the view of Glaeser, Przeworski, and Barrow, which state that countries that emerge from poverty accumulate human and physical capital under dictatorships, and then, once they become richer, are increasingly likely to improve their institutions.
Okay, so I hope that at this point that you already have a really good understanding of the main arguments and ideas of each of the texts. And so now, having this in mind, let's go back to our thesis and try to bring everything together. So on the left, you can see again our main thesis statement in case you forgot. And so let's see how the authors connect to this idea. In regard with the second part of our thesis, which is that growth strategies should be based on countries' individual characteristics, we believe it strongly aligns with Rodrik's arguments, even though it aligns too with Glaeser. So why do we think this? Well, he mentions repeatedly that there's no one size fits all or like no magical recipe when it comes to policies for developing growth. And this is exactly why the Washington Consensus failed, and why any other policy recommendation that is out of context and like not analyzed properly will be doomed to fail. So again, let's take China's example, which was mentioned previously, where they implemented very different policies than those recommended in the Washington Consensus and still faced a huge economic growth and expansion. So this was a surprise for many economists, but it aligns with our idea, again, that growth strategies should be based on countries' individual characteristics and not only on best practices or like generalized recommendations for all countries. Rodrik also makes allusion to this idea by his explanation of what would be an ideal way for formulating strategies for growth. And he mentions that it is essential to first undertake a diagnostic analysis, then to come up with a creative policy design, and finally to institutionalize these processes to maintain a dynamic economy. Now, in regards with the first part of our thesis, which is that inclusive economic institutions and economic growth are not dependent on inclusive political institutions, we believe Glaeser makes a really good point in regards to this, because he goes one step further, and instead of arguing whether inclusive or exclusive political institutions are the key for development, he strongly argues that political institutions are not that important, or that is not a very key point for fostering growth, as there is no direct causal effect. And in fact, he strongly argues that the most important or like influential factor is the investment or like the levels of human and social capital of a community, which basically is education. Also, just to recap, the example of North and South Korea, we think is really good to explain this point, because we can see that in a non-inclusive political institution, you can have a country which is poor and doesn't grow economically, but you can also have a country which grows potential like a lot in terms of economic growth. And well, in conclusion, we think that both readings, main ideas and examples back up our main thesis in several manners. And that's why we wanted to argue this thesis, taking into account the texts. And yeah, that's all. Thank you, and hope you enjoyed this presentation.